Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Keys to the Kingdom. Now, this is Volume 4 of the Locke Key series. Now, Locke Key is a horror/dark fantasy comic book series written by Joe Hill and illustrated by Gabriel Rodriguez and published by IDW Publishing. Now, the series was published between the years 2008 and 2013. This series was also the basis for the recent Netflix show of the same name. Now, I've already reviewed the first 3 volumes of this series, and I'll leave links in the description below to where you can check out those reviews. Now, what makes Keys to the Kingdom stand apart from the other volumes of this series is it's very episodic, where each chapter or issue collected in this volume can also work as a standalone story. Like, each of the issues collected in here really do stand on their own, and each of them deals with their own themes. But put together, it all tells a cohesive whole. It's structured very similarly to Neil Gaiman's Sandman series in that regard, and I believe Joe Hill said that the Sandman was one of the biggest inspirations for this, which is why maybe it shouldn't come as too much of a surprise that pretty soon there's going to be a Locke Key and Sandman crossover. And I'm excited for that, even though I have no idea how that's going to work continuity-wise, because Sandman is in the DC universe, and there are no implications whatsoever that Locke Key is in the DC universe. But I am kind of getting off topic. Now, the premise of Locke Key is it's about this family called the Lockes who moved to this small town in Massachusetts called Lovecraft shortly after the father in the family, Rendell Locke, is murdered, and they move to this place called Key House where Rendell grew up, and the Locke children discover that the house is filled with magic keys. Now, the main villain of this series is a man named Dodge, whose mind has been corrupted by a demon. Now, he looks like a teenage boy, but he's actually much older than that. Now, Dodge is pretending to be a teenage boy named Zack Wells, and is pretending to be friends with the Locke children, but this is all part of his plan to eventually get his hands on the Omega Key. Now, with the Omega Key, Dodge will be able to open the gateway to Hell, or some hell-like dimension, and bring forth demons into our world. Demons that he can control, and he will also be able to make more keys. Keys that could give him the power to rule the world. Now, Dodge is also able to transform himself into a woman with the help of what's known as the Gender Key, which is why the Locke children don't recognize him. And as I said, each chapter in Keys to the Kingdom kind of works as a standalone story, and you really do get to see Joe Hill experiment with tone and genre, and you also get to see Gabriel Rodriguez experiment with different artwork styles at certain points in this. Now, the first issue collected in here is called Sparrow, and this one is interesting because a lot of it is told from Bodhi's point of view, and because Bodhi is only a 7-year-old kid, a lot of the artwork in this is drawn almost in the Calvin and Hobbes style, which is an interesting juxtaposition because the artwork kind of jumps from that Calvin and Hobbes kind of artwork style to this real gritty style that most of the series is illustrated in. And this is where you really see Joe Hill and Gabriel Rodriguez experiment with tone, because it goes from being almost like a kid's story to this really gritty and violent horror story. Like, there's a certain point where Dodge has a fantasy of killing Bodhi and Kinsey, and even though it's not real, it's in his head, it's still pretty horrifically violent. But basically, the plot of this issue is Bodhi discovers the animal key. Basically, if you use this key to open a certain door and you walk through this door, you're transformed into whatever animal best represents you. So, Bodhi goes through the door and becomes a sparrow, but then Dodge finds the door and goes through it and becomes a wolf. And in his wolf form, he goes after Tyler and Kinsey, so Bodhi, who's now a sparrow, has to try to save them. But I really liked this issue, and I especially liked the experimentation with tone, where it goes from being really cute and whimsical to being really horrifically violent. The next issue collected in here is called White, and this one is about an African-American woman named Erin Voss who was actually friends with Rendell Locke when she was a teenager, but she's now committed to a psychiatric hospital, and she really doesn't talk much. All she says is white. Like, whenever certain people are around her, she just sort of freaks out going, white, it's white, and certain people kind of accuse her of being racist against white people, but you find out later on that's not the reason she's saying white. But Kinsey is trying to find out more information about her father and his connection to the Keys, so she tries to get close to Erin Voss, but because she kind of assumes that Erin is racist against white people, basically in the story, Bodhi finds what's known as the skin key that can actually change you into another ethnicity. So with the help of the skin key, Kinsey and Bodhi turn themselves into black kids, and they go to the psychiatric hospital posing as, like, volunteers. Now, I'm mostly being a smartass here because I really wasn't offended by this, but I can almost see some people saying, wait, isn't that like a form of blackface? But I don't think that was Joe Hill's intention, because the whole point of these keys is they change reality, so this key literally turned Kinsey and Bodhi into black people. Because the whole point of this issue is Kinsey, who, while she's certainly not racist, she might be a little ignorant about what it's like to live as a black person in modern day America. Here she is spending a day as a black person, and while things certainly aren't as bad as they were in the 60s, racism is still a thing in America today. And that is kind of the point of the story. And the story has a lot of really potent social commentary, especially at the end of it, but Erin Voss becomes a very important character later on in the series, and her whole backstory, when you find out what was done to her, honestly is pretty heartbreaking. Now, Erin was in the Netflix series, but for some reason in the show they changed her race. The next issue collected in here is called February, and this is probably my favorite of the issues collected in this particular volume. Basically, this issue is kind of a collection of little vignettes, each of them taking place on a different day in the month of February. And you see Kinsey, Tyler, and Bodhi discover new keys, and you get glimpses of different battles that they have with Dodge throughout the month. Obviously Dodge in different forms, because they still don't realize that their friend Zack Wells is actually Dodge. And you also see Kinsey and Bodhi being maybe a little reckless with the keys. For example, Kinsey shows her two friends, Scott and Jamal, the head key, and Bodhi shows his friend from school the giant key. But you also get glimpses into these characters' relationships. For example, Kinsey, because of her reckless behavior, kind of creates conflicts between her two friends, Scott and Jamal. And in this, Tyler discovers that his girlfriend is cheating on him. But again, this was a really good issue. It was funny, it was sad, and it also really explored the universe as well. The next issue collected in here is called Casualties, and this one follows the character of Rufus, who is this autistic boy who is introduced in Volume 2 of the series. Now, Rufus, while being autistic, actually has a pretty extensive knowledge of the military. It turns out that Rufus is actually living with Dodge because Dodge is also manipulating his mother. But in the story, Kinsey is babysitting Rufus, and he starts playing soldiers with Bodhi. You get glimpses into Rufus's imagination, and you realize that he imagines his toy soldiers as being alive. But it appears Rufus has the ability to see ghosts because he can see the ghost of Sam Lesser. Sam Lesser was a minor villain from earlier in this series. He was a young man who was being manipulated by Dodge, and then Dodge killed him. But this was a really good issue. It's filled with a lot of imagination, and in this you see just how evil Dodge is, because you see how abusive he is towards Rufus behind closed doors. Also, the opening page of this issue, it seems like it's done in kind of an EC comic style, which I really liked. Now, the volume ends with a two-part story called Detectives, and in this, Tyler starts to figure out that Zack Wells, who he thought was his best friend, is actually this demon that has been terrorizing his family. Meanwhile, you also have the police detective who was introduced earlier in this series, who starts to figure out that Zack might have something to do with some past murders. But basically, in these two issues, Dodge's facade is completely destroyed, and people start to realize what a monster he really is. And in these last two issues that are collected in this volume, you really do see Tyler grow as a character, and I would say this two-part story really is Tyler's story. And you realize that Tyler is a lot smarter than even he gives himself credit for. But overall, Volume 4 was a great addition to the series, and once again, you really do see Joe Hill and Gabriel Rodriguez experimenting with tone, genre, and style. In this volume, you get horror, you get drama, you get comedy, you get action, you get adventure, you get fantasy, you get social commentary, and it's all blended together very nicely. Also, with the little Calvin and Hobbes tribute and then the EC Comics tribute, it almost feels like sort of a love letter to comic books in general. But yeah, that was my review on Volume 4 of Locke Key, written by Joe Hill and illustrated by Gabriel Rodriguez, and bye.